So stripes is confusing. It's sort of like put in English, right? It's like, oh, I can put you up for the night, or oh man, that was a put down, or who put you up to that? Like it's this one word that has all these different meanings, but you can kind of understand what it is that we're talking about based on the context. So as far as today's presentation, I'm mostly going to be talking about stripes in terms of the JavaScript package, that collection of libraries that we use to access the backend, and then also Stripes CLI, the tooling that we use to build things. Now I can't advance my slides. All right, we'll see how this works. Okay, so does everybody know how Stripes got its name?
Is it like the stripes on the Okapi or something?
Yeah, so it is.
It is?
Yes. We'll get there, but you just took away my punchline. Why don't we call it Folio UI or the Folio User Interface Toolkit, which is way too long, or abbreviate that and call it PUTKit. It's pretty obvious why we did it. Why are they called stripes? As you said, it's an okapi, right? You can't really tell. Most people don't know what this animal is when you just see that part of it. It's like, looks like a giraffe, but it doesn't have the spots, but it's this thing. Yeah, the stripes are further down. And so okapi, which we all know is the back end, has stripes. And so the UI on the okapi is stripes. We're all really glad that you can distinguish it by the stripes and that we didn't name our back end giraffe, because then it wouldn't be stripes. It would be like reticulated polygons or something, which is a lot harder to say than stripes. So I'm really glad that we chose okapi as the name for our back end. So yeah, and okapi has stripes. I don't know who came up with that in the long history. I think it was someone clever at index data, because everybody in index data is very clever. But that's where the name comes from. So I should have a prize for you. I don't have any prizes, unfortunately. Okay, so that's what is stripes. Let's talk about some of the history for a little bit. Stripes basically got started in 2016, 2017. The first commits in all of these shared libraries, like I was talking about, Stripes Connect, which is sort of our library for API access, and Stripes Core, which is sort of the glue that all these applications plug into, and components, which are component libraries, headlines, buttons, and tables, and all that stuff. The initial work there started by Jason and Mike and John. And then December of that year, you see the first accessibility commit in Stripes component, where John Coburn was putting in an area labeled by for something. And so accessibility is one of these themes that you're going to see sort of arcing through the history of Stripes from the very beginning. It's something that's been important all along and that continues to be important. 2017, in May, the first locales, Danish and German and Hungarian, were added to UI tenant settings by Mike Taylor and Julian sitting right there. Interesting that they added those tenant settings in May, because it wasn't until August that we actually added internationalization to Stripes. But again, it shows that sort of planning that folks were talking about this morning at the keynote, in terms of internationalization and a global community is something that's built into OLF. The same thing is true in Stripes. Even, like I said, before we had a support for it, it's something that we were already working on and anticipating. I joined Stripes just after this May date. The folks at a meeting, it wasn't called WOLFcon yet, but there was a meeting in Dublin where they apparently put Stripes on the elephant. I don't know how we could distinguish ourselves from the elephant. But anyway, that was May, when I think a lot of this stuff first started coming together. Let's see what else we have here. So 2018 is the first time we saw Stripes CLI. Again, this is a developer-focused tool, but enabled us to just have we had this sort of hodgepodge Frankenstein collection of tools that we use to build the UI. Stripes CLI pulled all that stuff into a single package and really made things a lot better for us. April was the introduction of Big Test, which was a framework that was developed and first brought only unit testing, but first introduced testing to the software project. And so testing is another one of those themes that you're going to see sort of arcing through. The first commit there, I want to say, was in Stripes components. It might have been in e-resources, but sort of spread out from there. And testing is something that has sort of proceeded ever since. And so we have pretty good test coverage throughout the rest of our components. By the time we get to June, we've got 9 applications in the platform, check in and check out, some basic circulation, developer tools, and then inventory organizations, plus searching users. Organizations, I can't remember if organizations became tenant settings or if it was other organization settings. But anyway, 9 applications in 2018. And then, as I mentioned, Stripes, the collection of frameworks, also by Matt Jones, same guy who wrote Stripe CLI for us, brought that collection of tools, Connect and components and core all together into a single package, which for developers at least really simplified things. Didn't really show through to the front end, but really simplified things for developers by giving them one package to manage instead of half a dozen. By the time you get to December, just 6 months later, there are 16 applications that we have as part of the development platform and 11 locales, including Chinese and also Arabic. Arabic is important to note because, again, like thinking about this theme of internationalization, it's a right to left instead of left to right. And so if you notice the screenshot, it's not as simple as basically just having the text flow. The entire application, right, is flipped left to right. And so getting all of our components designed with internationalization in mind, getting the entire UI framework to support that, not just at the level of the individual words, but in terms of the entire layout supporting that is on the one hand obvious that you'd have to do it correctly, but it's not trivial to do, and it does sort of filter down all the way through to the individual components to make sure that stuff to make sure that it works. And so it's been really fun to see different locales trickling over time. I work mostly on, well, I work all over the place now, but I do a lot of work in Stripes core, and for a long time it was my job. Every time Peter Murray would say, "Hey, we've got a new locale," and I would get to go in and just type in the 4 letters for we're adding this or that. But it always gave me sort of a little thrill to see that scope expanding, that we're introducing more and more locales. I love that aspect of it. Okay. 2019, I think somebody mentioned Aster this morning, that was our first name release in January of 2019. June was the first Jest PR. Jest is just another testing framework. The original, again, was Big Test. Jest was something much bigger in sort of greater React community and in the greater JavaScript community. And so this is sort of a bit of aligning with community standards. Something else that'll come up as I go through some of these other slides is Folio. React was an established platform at the time that we started writing Stripes, but some of the things that we were doing in terms of Stripes Connect, in terms of Big Test, didn't really have community standards at the time they were written. And so that's been really awesome in terms of the fact that we were able to bring those things in early on. But it's also presented some challenges because we've adopted our own way of doing things only to see a different community standard arise. And we want to try to adopt those community standards, but Folio is a large project. And so I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll come back to this theme at the end, but it's one of the reasons that sometimes the wheels here turn very slowly, is that we've done a lot of work and we have a lot of applications. And so we can't just immediately pivot when we have almost 100 applications to a different internationalization framework or a different form handler or a different testing library. But just from June of 2019 got started then, and most of our tests at this point are written in Jest. In September and October here, I mentioned React Query and SWR. Those are not things that, well, we now use React Query in our project. These are basically alternatives to Stripe Connect, right, which are coming out in 2019. And as I said, we had those things back at the end of 2016. So this is basically 3 years later before these things that have arrived as community standards were available. And so that's why we didn't pick them up. They didn't exist yet. And so we had to write Stripes Connect. And it was great. It served us very well, but we're trying to, again, move to these things. But we couldn't. They weren't around at the time that we started. And then again, Chomos goes live that year in October, as we heard earlier. And by the end of 2019, there's 40 applications in the platform, which brings us to 2020. Everybody remember 2020? No, 2020, so VEET, another very popular framework that you hear a lot of buzz about now in the UI community that, again, didn't start until 2020. So again, just sort of setting some context for, I don't want to say how ahead of the game we were, but a lot of these things that are really big, we didn't have access to because they hadn't started yet. It's not like they weren't mature, they didn't exist. Developer tools sort of continued to grow at that point. I wrote I Can't Has Endpoint and Babies, which is my personal favorite. If you've had a kid on the Folio project, have you ever been watching a Pixar movie and at the end they have that screen where they list all the babies? We have a babies page in Folio that we've got a bunch of kids' names in. If you guys want to contribute because you have family that's been growing while you've been working on Folio, send me your kid's name and we'll add it in the developer tools. It's my I love seeing that. Just like I love adding all the locales, I love seeing families grow. So DevTools has been one of the things also that I work on a bunch. Lehigh went live in August, and the first library in the US. And then in 2020, I mentioned React Query a couple of slides ago. We've added React Query on our project. Michal Kulklis did that work for us to basically start slowly but surely to replace Stripes Connect, a local development API access tool, with React Query, which is this one of the sort of community standards. And we also sort of started breaking up some of our development tools. This is a little bit internal stuff, but Stripes Core, which again is that piece that knits all the applications together, also used to contain all the tooling to compile our stuff, which made it hard to share some of our components. It was just everything sort of had to go through Stripes Core, even if you didn't need Stripes Core. So finally started to get some of that stuff broken apart. July, Cornell went live, and then TAMU, where WOLFcon 2020 was hosted, are also live. And then that November, John Coburn from EBSCO added Deku Axe to Stripes testing, which is sort of our shared testing library. So again, coming back to that theme of accessibility, adding Axe to the Stripes testing, Deku Axe is an API that can kind of help to assess accessibility in terms of, do you have the right contrast? Do you have sufficient font sizes? Are your things correctly labeled? Do you tab in order correctly through the page? Makes that sort of base level of accessibility testing really easy across all our applications. And so being able to test at least the baseline of accessibility by literally just clicking a button and say, does this page conform, is I think really powerful in terms of showing both the commitment to accessibility, but also at least ensuring that we meet the minimum of standards. There's many, many layers to accessibility. Part of it is making sure, the way I sort of think of accessibility in my head is navigating around a street. Part of it is, do you have labels on all your streets, right? Part of it is your city easy to get around in? And DQ, or Axe at least, allows you to say, is all my stuff labeled correctly? Like, can I actually, if I know what I'm looking for, can I find it? You might still be stuck in Boston, where everything is, totally jumbled and it's hard to navigate, but at least there's labels on everything. And so just saying that you conform or that you passed an Axe test isn't enough to say, okay, great, my pages are accessible, but it at least provides a sort of automated way of asserting that base level of accessibility. And again, like I said, just a theme from the very beginning, something that continues to show up. By the end of 2021, 55 applications. So again, Folio just keeps growing and growing and growing. 2022, Library of Congress announces that they are planning to adopt Folio. 2023, Michal, who did the same work, like I said, adding React Query and doing some of that internal development to improve our tools, replaced our Babel loader, with ESCO loader. This is basically saying we went from one compiler and now we use a different compiler. That cut our build time by like 80%, which was huge. Again, as the project continued to grow, it also got harder and harder to build. There's a lot of problems that don't show up when you have 10 lines of code. When you have 10,000, it's a different story. And so that's also one of the things, incidentally, that we found with Big Test. When we had a couple of applications and they were relatively small, it was totally fine. As the project got bigger and bigger and bigger, we discovered there were memory leaks in Big Test. And so basically, the larger it got, the more we needed those tests, the more likely those tests were to crash. And so that was one of the challenges. And big test was also sort of alpha, and so we knew we needed to move on from it. But it's a problem of scale, basically. The bigger it gets, the harder it is to manage. And so that's trying to deal with that size has been an interesting challenge. And then last April, we also did some work with Module Federation, a tool that I'll come back to in a little bit. Right now, we talk a lot about running Folio as separate pieces rather than as a monolith. We have all these separate back-end modules that can be run independently, but the UI is created as monolith. It's a single bundle that is static. So you figure out, okay, what are all the different applications that we're going to provide access to for an individual tenant? We collect them all into a single JavaScript bundle and deploy them. But then, that's like a 50 meg bundle. And just to hit the login page, because we've collected all of that stuff into one single bundle. What Module Federation allows us to do is separate Stripe's core, which would contain authentication and authorization, from users, from inventory, from requests, from all those different pieces. And so those will only get loaded as needed, basically. And so this will have an impact on end users from the point of view that the time to the first byte, when you're loading that login page, will come a lot quicker, and you'll only basically be loading the applications that you need. So a lot more efficient. Okay, so that's what is Stripes and what have we been up to the last couple of years. What are some of the things that we're working on now? Right now, the platform has 69 applications. We have more than 25 different shared libraries, some of the old ones I mentioned. There's also shared libraries that are dedicated to acquisitions, to authority, to data transfer, ERM, inventory, and market. And so within sort of collections of applications, we're adding collections of shared libraries that serve those things. And then internationalization continues to be a major theme. We have 28 locales. We added Dutch just, I think, a week or two ago. Chinese, Japanese, and German are near 100% across most of the core frameworks, like Stripe's core and things like that, and across many of the applications as well. And then some of these others are 60, 80, 90% across individual applications. In some cases, we'll have a tenant that says, "Oh, we're going to use requests, or we're going to use particular applications," and so we'll be at 100% across one of those applications, if not across the entire platform. But it's exciting to see that there are so many locales that have such completeness across the whole platform. Accessibility, like I said, it continues to be a major theme. Wasn't quite an audit, I don't know what the phrase is, but basically, as of November 2023, there was an evaluation, and we managed to hit WCAG. I don't even know what that stands for anymore. 2.1 AA certification, almost all the way across Folio. There's some additional work that came out of that in terms of improvements that we can make. There's always room for improvements, basically, when it comes to accessibility. You can always tweak it, and whether it's providing more labels or just providing better organization. We filed a bunch of tickets as a result of that evaluation, and that's been ongoing. But like I said, even though there's work to be done, the fact that we were able to hit AA is great. And I know WCAG 2.2 is out now, I believe, and so we'll be looking at the next generation of standards and continuing to try to improve. But that's, again, a theme that's been there since the very beginning and something that we continue to work on. Testing is also a major theme. There was that first commit with Big Test. We've got 80% code coverage across most of our repositories. We also have Stripes testing, which I mentioned John adding Axe to. That's the sort of shared testing library that provides shared testing components so that individual application developers can sort of use components for writing their tests and don't have to sort of do the whole soup to nuts of testing. They can use these components that will allow them to find the different waypoints on a page and leverage them to write a test. I think of testing as sort of like a love letter to your future self, for your code. People think of testing as proof that your code works correctly, which to me is sort of one small aspect of testing. The great thing about testing for me is that when you are working on stuff in the future, you actually get to prove that you didn't break the stuff that you wrote in the past. right? And so it's less about proving that the feature that you're working on right now is correct, although that's part of it. It's also whether you're doing this development in the future or somebody else picks this up, because a lot of our stuff is written either by teams of people, or we'll get pull requests from someone who isn't normally contributing in a particular module. They can be confident that the work they're doing doesn't break anything that happened, because unanticipated side effects cause all kinds of problems. And so having good coverage helps you be less worried about those unanticipated side effects, right? Everything that used to work, everything that used to be tested is still tested. And so anyway, I don't mean to philosophize, but it's anyway, that's my spiel on testing. One more of our themes. Again, we talked about, or I talked earlier about the Folio Stripes package, centralizing some of our developer tools. Stripes CLI continues to be that on the developer side. We have all these different dependencies that go into developing for compiling translations, for doing linting, for doing testing. And again, we're trying to just centralize that stuff and pull more of it into one single place to relieve developers of the burden of maintaining that in each individual application. And so hopefully that will be something to simplify development. We also recently rolled out shared workflows. This is something a lot of the developers in different applications might be aware of, because GitHub just deprecated something they've been warning us about for a long time, but I don't tend to read the logs of my test files when they're successful, and only read them when they fail. And so that warning's been in there for a long time that, hey, we're going to deprecate this API. And like last Tuesday, I think they finally turned off that API. And so literally out of our 90 applications, 85 of them broke. We couldn't commit any code in GitHub because they were this deprecated API. And so it meant that every single developer in every single application had to go in and reset the version number to say, all right, instead of version 2, I want version 4. With shared workflows, I can actually do that in the central file, and I can just update the shared workflow, and then everybody who's pointed at that shared file automatically, gets that update. And so again, simplifying the development process, and basically instead of having everybody have to do that work, we can do it in one place. Other benefits from the particular kind of work that he did, our build process has a dozen steps. Some of them have to be followed one after the other, but others you can do in parallel, right? If you're just compiling the translations, you don't have to wait for the tests to complete. You can do those two things at the same time. And so another big improvement here was parallelization of some of those independent steps. Refresh token rotation is something also that we've been working on a lot over the last year. It's something that dramatically improves the security posture of Folio writ large. Some of that came from the back end. There's also been a ton of work on the front end. RTR is, it stands for refresh token rotation, the token being the API token that you get from the back end and that you basically send in every single request that proves that you have access to the API. So from the beginning of Folio, basically once you logged in, you got a token, and that token was good forever. Did not have an expiration date. The way we log you out is we threw away the token. But if somebody, managed to find that token or somehow steal it from you, right, they could actually just take that token, and even though you had deleted on your computer, they would have been able to use it on theirs and log into Folio as you. So with refresh token rotation, we actually have expiration dates on our tokens, and then there's a bunch of work and handshaking that sort of goes back and forth between the front end and the back end to exchange those tokens. I'm not going to get into the details of how RTR works. It's been a long and complicated, but I think ultimately successful deployment over the last year or so that we've been working on that work. The other thing that came with RTR, with our particular implementation of it, is that we used to sort of use JavaScript to make that request to the back end, and then we would hold that token in Stripes. So what that meant is that if there was, say, a nefarious third-party library, they could read that data in Stripes, and again, they would have access to that token. So even now that it's being rotated, in theory, if they had access to it, they could use it while that token was fresh, right before it had expired. Tokens moved into cookies that are accessible only as HTTP-only cookies. And an HTTP-only cookie basically means JavaScript doesn't have access to it. The browser will say, oh, this cookie belongs to this domain, and it'll send it in all those requests automatically. But the JavaScript code, Stripes, and any other piece of JavaScript code that we rely on no longer has access to that data. And so security is one of those themes that is starting to become more prominent in the course of development, something that we're sort of paying more attention to, whether it's with RTR specifically or with some of the other code. And then you also heard about Eureka this morning. So one of the things that we've been working on with Eureka is runtime service discovery. So I mentioned that right now, the way we build Stripes is we create this bundle that has all your applications in it. Well, one of the things in that bundle is basically, like I said, a list of all the applications. When you bundle up Stripes, you give it a config file, and it says, all right, here's how I want to connect to the back end, and here's some of my settings, and here's my list of UI modules. So one of the things that we're looking at with Eureka is working with Module Federation. Instead of having that list of applications be part of the bundle at the beginning, it'll be something that you read via an API request once you've authenticated. And so we can then change what access a tenant might have after it's been deployed without having to rebuild the entire bundle, right? Because Module Federation will let us load those pieces individually. All we really have to do is change the discovered list, right? So the first time you log in, maybe it says, okay, you've got 10 applications. We can update that discovered list, and now you can hit refresh, and presto, you've got 15. We didn't have to, on the operations side, build a new tenant bundle or anything like that. More improvements are coming with RTR. Like I said, that rollout was a bit rocky. But we've done a lot of work on the Eureka side to improve that and add some polish. Fixed length session timeout is one of the things that we're adding there. So if you're familiar maybe with like a VPN that you log into, and the VPN will say only give you a 4-hour window, and then after say 4 hours, it forces you to authenticate again. That's something else that we can add, or that we've been working on with Eureka, is that enforced timeout. So not only idle session timeout, which is, I signed in and then I went off with my colleague to get coffee. We can have Stripes log you out automatically after some preset amount of time, but we can also force, with a fixed length session, we can force re-authentication, right? So even if you've been sitting at your desk for the last 4 hours, if we want to force people to, prove that they're still the same person, and then not just, some automated tool that's clicking a mouse or something to simulate session activity, we can force authentication after a certain timeout. So that's fixed length session timeout. Another thing that's coming with Eureka is completely externalizing authentication. So I already mentioned we've moved the access token from JavaScript into cookies with external authentication via Keycloak. Authentication is actually happening in a totally separate space. So the username and password are no longer even passing through Stripes. We're going to exchange a one-time code that we get from Keycloak to get us the authentication tools. So again, just better security posture, basically, right? Now we're no longer exposed to the tokens, and we're no longer exposed to the password as well. So lots of work happening on the security front. And then this is just a little bit of a look at some of the sort of historical activity, I guess, across some of our repositories. This one's Stripes Connect. So Stripes Connect, you can see here, super busy over the last couple of years, or as it started, and then really petering out over the last 2 years. You can see Mike Taylor and Jason Skomorowski were the big authors in that library early on, and we continue to work on maintenance over time. But activity from that has really stalled as we've moved on to React Query. This one is Stripes Core, a bit more activity again. Big work from Mike Taylor and Michal early on. And you can see I've been working on it in little bits and pieces, but some of the stuff is maintenance, some of the stuff is features, but it's basically software's never done, right? I ran across the expression, software doesn't rot, right? Like people are like, why do we have to keep maintaining this? So like I wrote it and it was perfect. Yeah, but the ecosystem evolves, right? And different standards evolve and different browsers evolve. And so even though something might be finished from a feature point of view, just like, authentication worked for the last 7 years, but we decided that we wanted to change the way we handled it because thinking about security and about tokens has really evolved. And so you see the same thing in software libraries. You're never just done, even if the particular code is done, somebody discovers a vulnerability in a third-party library, and so then you need to update it. And we see the same thing here. Like I said, a ton of work early on to set the pieces up, and then lots of maintenance over time. And you see the same thing here in Stripes components. Stripes components even a lot more activity as we've either added new components or done work with accessibility, work with internationalization. That stuff really continues. All right, finally, what's next? So React 19 is something that's sort of right around the corner. I think we started on, say it was version 15 or 16. React 19 isn't out yet, but we're basically preparing for it. A lot of the work to remove the deprecated stuff has already been done as part of reminisce. The rest of that's probably going to come with S, which is sunflower. React 19 was announced back in the spring, and then they made some sort of internal changes that I think they didn't anticipate were largely incompatible with the way a lot of third parties loaded their stuff. Things that used to happen in parallel were now happening in a waterfall, sort of the opposite of what I described by moving to our shared workflows, right? So when they realized that, they sort of backed up and said, "Oh, we're going to have to go redesign that," because everybody basically screamed that this stuff now is much slower. But React 19 is coming, and so we started the process of figuring out what that work is going to be, and starting to take it on. Transpile unpublished. I'm sort of into the nitty gritty behind this, but this is something else that's going to help out developers more than end users are going to see it. Transpiling basically JavaScript. Well, I'm trying to think how to explain this. There's a different, the way that we write JavaScript in our applications is a little bit different than what the final version that your browser runs is. And the way we get from the way we write it, the way your browser runs it, is called transpiling. We don't call it compiling because it's JavaScript when you write it, and it's JavaScript when it gets run. But we sort of write it in the newest version possible with all kinds of syntactic sugar that makes it really nice. It's a good developer experience, but it's not as compatible. And so transpiling sort of removes that syntactic sugar and restructures the code to use the version that's the most compatible with the most browsers. So that process is called transpilation. And early on, we, like I said, we're bundling folios or bundling stripes as one big thing. And so we just stuffed all of our transpilation tools into one tool and prepared the whole bundle all at once. That makes it really difficult to use individual pieces like stripes components outside of the rest of the framework. And so, for example, Marva, which you'll hear about if you're learning about the successor to Mark and that cataloging. We're trying to figure out how to integrate Marva with Stripes components, and that's been a challenge because they've written that with TypeScript, which doesn't play nice with the way that we are currently publishing Stripes components. So anyway, like Jest as a replacement for Big Test, transpiling our individual applications is something that's just sort of a community standard. And so it's something that we are working toward. Hopefully that will also simplify that whole process of transpiling and bundling. Like I said, it was written in 2016, 2017. It's a little bit crufty and it's pretty elaborate. It was, again, one of those things that was a good idea at the time when we had a few applications. Now that we have 70, and it takes minutes again to build our bundle, we're thinking, no, maybe that wasn't the right way to do it. Or it was the right thing at the time, but now we're in a different place. One of the other things that we're working on is replacing yarn. Yarn is the tool that we use to collect all our dependencies. Should have done this in the opposite order. It's basically, first you install all your dependencies, then you transpile them, and then you get your bundle at the end. So yarn is the tool that we use to collect all of our dependencies. Yarn v1 has been deprecated for a long time. So we wanted to replace it for a long time. We looked at moving from version 1 to version 4 and had a great proof of concept that looked really solid from all of our Mac developers. And then we asked one of our Windows guys, like, hey, can you just test this before we finish? Because we're almost done. We just want to make sure it works. And it didn't work at all. The promise was that it was supposed to, but some of the tooling under the hood basically is not reliable in a Windows environment. And then Yarn itself now relies on a part of NPM called CorePack that also turns out to sort of be in flux in the NPM environment. And so the rug got yanked out from under us a little bit on that one, which is sort of frustrating. So Yarn v4 didn't work out real well. NPM, which is basically sort of grandfather of the whole JavaScript ecosystem, has some of its own tooling. Again, it's something that works really well on a small project. We have a few thousand third-party dependencies when you're bundling, our 100 applications, and the tools that NPM provides to sort of do that build analysis are just not great at scale. Like they're fine on a small project, they're not great on a big one, and it hasn't worked out well for us. PNPM is another one that we're looking at. It's wicked fast, which is awesome. It provides great consistency from build to build, which is also great. It doesn't work with our TypeScript config because, again, we have a sort of messy and legacy build system, and PNPM basically doesn't support some of the stuff that we're sort of doing in legacy land. And so it's been a challenge to basically find something that ticks all the boxes. So that's been frustrating. We've been working on trying to replace this literally for years. And every time we think we're getting close, we find out, oh, it doesn't work in this place, or it doesn't work on that place, or it works for all of these applications except for these 4. So we keep stubbing our toes on different things. Yarn is very old, and we've gotten dinged by different people who are like, why don't you just upgrade Yarn? Because then you wouldn't have this other problem. It's like, well, lots of different projects. React itself still has a Yarn version 1 block file. So on the one hand, we feel terrible for using Yarn 1. On the other, it is still basically part of the community standard, and it isn't clear what the future of these tools is going to be. It's something we're going to continue to iterate on, that we're continuing to try to explore to figure out, all right, can we improve our Webpack config and our TypeScript config such that we could use PNPM? Because it would be really nice to get the same kind of improvement with installations that we saw, like when we moved away from our Webpack bundler. It'd be great to have a similar improvement with installation as well. We haven't found something that works across the board. I'm hopeful that we can figure out how to make one of these things work by the time we get to Sunflower, but we'll see. It's something we're chipping away at, but haven't found a good solution for yet. Module Federation, I mentioned earlier and sort of described again, with runtime service discovery and Module Federation working together, we can really, again, change the way that we build stuff and deploy stuff. This will be more of a change sort of operationally rather than something that affects individual developers. Developers won't have to do anything differently with Stripes, but this will really change the way that the operations teams can manage a deployed UI. We're also trying to get rid of Moment, and again, more just like cruft that was state of the art when we started working on this in 2016-17, things that are no longer state of the art. That's mostly done, and we're hoping to do that, I think, in the next release. We're just basically waiting until we have other breaking changes so we can make them all at once, right? So just have a clean break rather than forcing people to upgrade every single time we make a change. We also need to find a new form handler. This is, again, the same thing. We picked libraries and sort of backed the wrong horse. It turns out with regard to our form handlers, we used a library called Redux Form, and the author that's like, oh, no, don't use Redux Form anymore. Use this other one called Final Form. And then he abandoned that one too. So that was, we got pretty lucky with some things, in terms of the way we handle CSS basically in our project turns out to be exactly the way the community has standardized over the last 7 years. So that was a big win. We have John Colbert to thank for that. I don't know if that was luck or skill, but we'll take it. He laid out how we wanted to handle CSS. And that continues to basically be the state of the art. We were not so lucky with forms, and so that's something that we're going to have to look at, because basically every time we add a new form that's based on our current framework, we know we're going to have to rework how that gets processed, because those form libraries aren't being maintained. So that's something else that we're looking at. Other things, we're using React Query, like I said, as a replacement for Stripes components, which is great. We are on React Query version 3. The current release is version 5. Same thing with React Router, we're at 5. I think they just came out with 7. And I mentioned React itself, which just is about to release a new major version. Those are all things that were sort of big, like underlying low-level things that, you know, an application might not deal with on a daily basis, but they sort of have hooks into these shared libraries for navigation, for accessing an API, right? So it's, you know, not the core of the application, but something that it needs. Every single application needs to do its job. And so why is upgrading all this stuff so hard? Does anybody here have kids and familiar with the BOWS? Familiar with the book, If You Give a Mouse a Cookie? People know this book, right? It's like, if you want to do this thing, well, you got to do this thing first. If you want to do that thing, well, you got to do this other thing first. That is the story of Stripes development, right? So we wanted to upgrade favicons, which just does the, you know, the little icon that shows up in your tab, right? So you get the little folio B. We wanted to upgrade that 7.14 to 7.15. Not even like new features, right? That's supposed to just be a bug fix release. So it should have no impact except that things should get better. We can't even do anything new. All we're going to hopefully see is fewer bugs. Okay, so one thing they did in the 7.15 is they dropped support for Node 14. So that's a breaking change technically, because it used to be that you could compile your applications on version 14. Now you can't. That didn't affect us because we were already on Node 18 at the time that this happened. But still, like, no one gets semantic versioning right. They always like, oh, I'm just going to make this, you know, patch release, but really a patch release is a major release. Okay, so that was a goof on their part. But again, it shows you can't, you know, you want to do a small thing and it's actually a bigger thing. Something else they did in 7.15 was upgrading Sharp from 32.6 to 33.1. That turns out also to be a major upgrade because when you were doing Semver and the leading number is a 0, 32 to 30. This is actually going from 32 to 33, not 0 to 0. This is also turns out to be a breaking change because Sharp in version 33 doesn't support version 1 anymore of Yarn. And so I got into a big long discussion with the author of favicons, and the guy from Sharp actually chimed in and was like, oh, you just need to change the build script that you're using for Sharp. And I said, I don't even depend on Sharp. It's favicons that depends on Sharp. And so I don't have a build script that I can change. And so we wound up pinning to version 7.14, just because, you know, it's just this, like I said, there's these layers and layers and layers of things. And so you want to try to do one thing and it leads to another. And it presents a lot of challenges. And so it's the same reason that we haven't upgraded, you know, Yarn ourselves, because, you know, you look at one thing and it becomes something else. And so the planning for all this stuff, all the work that you need to do before you can get the work done, right? Like all we want to do is upgrade favicons. We have to upgrade Node, we have to upgrade Yarn, we have to upgrade Sharp. The technical term for the work you need to do or the work you want to do, does anybody know the technical term for that? Oh, yak shaving. So you talk about yak shaving, it's like, all right, you want to do one thing, but you have to do something else first, right? It's the work that you have to do before the work that you want to do. Which is kind of what I think of as Stripes, right? Like no one's trying to write Stripes for Folio. What we're trying to do is write a user's application that gives you access to your patrons. We're trying to write a requests app that helps you manage requests or circulation, right? We have all these apps that are basically the user-facing side of it. Stripes is the yak shaving of all those applications, providing a consistent way to manage API access, providing a consistent way to handle authentication and authorization and security and accessibility and internationalization so that we don't have 75 different internationalization libraries, right? We provide one service and then all the applications can tap into it. And so on the one hand, that maybe makes Stripes development a little bit harder because we're always asking people like, all right, you know how to do this, but we want you to do it our way. But what that allows is to have, for end users to have a consistent experience and also for developers to perhaps be able to help out across different applications and provide a consistent experience there as well. And so I don't think we can put Stripes on a yak, but we can try. Anyway,
You have to shave it first.
yeah, you have to shave it first. Anyway, that's it. About at time, but I'm happy to stick around and answer questions.
So, I'm just curious, how many people, you may have said, it, how many people are working on Stripes right now? And what happens if somebody leaves? Because
Right.
it does feel like we really need everybody that knows what's going on there quite a bit.
Yeah, okay, so I'll repeat this for the folks on Zoom. The question was, how many people are working on Stripes right now, and what happens if somebody leaves? There's basically two of us who are doing most of the development on Stripes right now. It's myself and John Coburn are the people who are, meeting regularly and trying to do some of this planning, in addition to Kalila, who helps us sort out those priorities. Because John and I will say, oh, we want to do these 100 things this week. And Kalila will say, that's nice. Let's pick two. Maybe let's pick one. Because there's lots of different top priorities, right? And so we have a ton of improvements. You saw the different things that are sort of on the roadmap. We have a lot of ideas about things that we want to move forward, things that we need to move forward because they're getting deprecated. But it is the two of us who are doing most of that work. As far as succession planning, I don't know that we have a specific plan for what happens. We'll take any help that we can get if developers who are interested. We're happy to accept pull requests from anywhere, or to hear from people about what they think their priorities are. John and I think about it mostly from the point of view of application development, right? What services can we provide in Stripes to other developers? Some of that again gets serviced to end users in the form of internationalization, in the form of accessibility and security. A lot of the work that we're doing does sort of sit under the hood, right? There's not, for example, with RTR, with token rotation, for the most part, people won't interact with that directly. I guess idle session timeout, that does sort of get reflected into user land. But a lot of this stuff really happens under the hood. And so that's the way that we tend to think of it. But if there's priorities that come from the community about user-facing things, we're happy to learn more about it and to at least sort of incorporate it into planning. But at the moment we're a small team, and so chip away at the pieces we can. Anybody else?
Does the internationalization work happen sort of as libraries need them?
I have to be honest, I have no idea. Basically, the only piece, the hooks for internationalization are built into Stripes core, and we have basically certain tags that you add to your application to basically say, this is an internationalized phrase, right? And so there's a static key that gets written. So the key is the same, and then the value is different in every locale. There's a whole separate process that basically in each repository grabs all those keys and then sends them up to localize. And then localize is a third-party tool that we've been working with for years. And there's a group of translators that basically looks at those keys and says, all right, here's a new one, I'm going to add it in Portuguese, or I'm going to add it in Polish. And then Peter Murray, who we heard about this morning doing IT support, wrote a bunch of scripts that basically, like I said, first suck that stuff out of the repositories and then also do it in reverse. And so I think every couple of days, every couple of weeks, a script basically grabs all those translation keys or translation values out of localize and then commits them back into the individual repositories. I don't know the process of how we find translators or exactly how that works. From the software point of view, though, it's magic, right? But by providing the hooks,
Community that works? Open source translator or
I honestly, I have no idea. I have no idea how that side of it works. Yeah, and because all I see is, like I said, there's an API request that pulls them out, and then, every 2 weeks I see a localization commit that brings it back in. So, I don't know what that process is. If you're interested in, I would say, talk to Peter, and either because you have connections who can help with localization, or he can at least explain, get you access to localize, or get the folks who need it to provide those translations. Anybody else?
There are different translation groups that are working,
Okay.
at least in German and Sweden.
Yeah. One of the things that's come up as a theme over and over is how do we work with translations of the dynamic data, like patron groups, like record types and things like that. We have great support for the things like field headers and labels, things that don't change, right? That are essentially going to be the same in every single installation. What we haven't figured out a good solution to as a community is, what about the multilingual library that's in Canada that needs to present everything in English and French? What about a library in Ethiopia or Saudi Arabia that needs to present stuff in Italian and Arabic? We haven't figured out how to manage that kind of API data so that we can have a good solution that can, within this individual tenant, present those values in different locales. There's been some work and some proofs of concept that have been done with it. We haven't figured out how to sort of leverage that in a way that'll work across the board. So there's definitely still some challenges with it. That's an interesting, I don't want to call it research, but it's something we continue to think about, but haven't figured out yet.
I'm thinking of some of the projects that are using the Stripes UI, but are not strictly part of the Folio product release. So like the Folio Shanghai implementation, or the Project Reshare uses the Stripes UI. What, if anything, is the relationship, between those folks working on their UI and the Stripes core team? Is there sharing going in either direction?
I don't have a great answer. I think there hasn't been a whole lot of sharing, not because we're not willing to share, but my hope is that Stripes has been really successful for them and has done what they've needed, which is why we haven't heard a whole lot of, hey, what about this? What about that? So yeah, I don't know. A lot of the folks who I know who are working on Reshare worked on Stripes early on. And so I know those folks and haven't heard from them, which to me tells them, they're happy with the work they did. So I think that's a credit to them more than anything. Yeah, it's been relatively quiet, I guess, but we're listening if anybody wants to talk to us or offer contributions back. Thanks. Thank you. Oh, one more.
I'm sorry. Can you talk a little bit about the Stripes architecture group?
Sure.
Yeah.
So Stripes architecture is sort of informally, it's a Slack channel that you can join. It's also a meeting that's Thursdays at 10 a.m. Eastern. That is basically anybody who wants to can come and sort of talk about things that would affect the platform, either problems you're having or solutions that you like or want to propose. It's been a relatively small community. John Hilburn and I and Jason from Index Data has been a regular contributor. Sometimes it is just griping about the state of UI software development because browsers change and we can't do anything about them. And what are we having to deal with this week, or whatever got deprecated at GitHub. But sometimes it's also planning for some of these big things, like, how are we going to handle internationalization of dynamic data? How are we going to handle, upgrading NPM on Windows, or whatever it is. There are lots of places where having separate projects is great because they can iterate fast and not worry about the whole community. The way that cuts against you is then, you wind up with everything split and different things happening across all the different projects. And so we encourage people who are doing UI development to join that channel and maybe even to join those meetings. We would love to hear from people who have ideas about how things could be improved, or about, you know, frameworks that they're seeing emerge as community standards that maybe we should think about adopting. We're happy to improve. Like I said, it's John and I, and so we're happy to have more support and more community involvement from anybody who feels like they have the resources. It's a casual group, and we're always happy to learn from people who have expertise. So please join us if you have the time.